The Trust had subjected the nurses to harassment by permitting their biological male trans woman colleague to use the female changing room, and also requiring the nurses to share that changing room without providing suitable alternative facilities. The Tribunal also found the Trust harassed the nurses by not taking seriously and declining to address their concerns. It said the behaviour of the Trust violated the dignity of the claimants and created a hostile, intimidating, humiliating and degrading environment for them. It also upheld a claim of indirect sex discrimination against the Trust. It said women are more likely than men to experience feelings of fear, distress and humiliation by, in effect, being required to change their clothes in front of a member of the opposite sex. The Tribunal, I should say, though, did reject claims made by the nurses against Rose Henderson personally of harassment and victimisation. They said Rose had not behaved in a way to harass or victimise the nurses. It dismissed claims that Rose had behaved inappropriately towards them inside that changing room.
Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. So wonderful news about the Darlington Nurses. They won their case. This has been going on since 2023. So they have won their case and it's been found that the NHS Trust was liable for harassment. These women, when they objected, when they complained, they were given an alternative space to change, and it was basically a small room with a filing cabinet. Their changing room was taken away from them, while the man had the whole changing room to himself. On top of that, they had to prepare themselves for work every day, knowing that this was hanging over their heads. They were dealing with patients, some of whom may have passed away, dealing with people's loved ones, dealing with that every day. And on top of that, they had to have a man in their changing room. I'm sure they struggled with their job security, knowing that if they spoke up and made a complaint, that it could very well affect their careers. For the longest time, women have been told that they're not allowed to object, that these men are suddenly women and have to be accepted as women. But thankfully, these nurses took it all the way, and they even had the support of J.K. Rowling, who had the following to say. Women have the right not to undress in front of men at work. 20 years ago, that sentence would have been a statement of such obviousness that people would have laughed at you for saying it aloud. Now it's a matter for celebration. Congratulations, you heroines. So the tribunal said that it wasn't the man himself who was liable for harassment, it was the employer, the NHS Trust. But no matter how you look at it, this is a man who insisted on being in a women's changing room, knowing full well that it made the women uncomfortable. They said this man asked one of the nurses when she was going to get changed. He asked her 3 times, and this led her to have a panic attack.
These 7 nurses went into battle with their employer, taking their NHS Trust to court for allowing a transgender colleague to use a female changing room.
Our dignity has been affected. You know, it's not dignified to walk into a changing room and be expected to get changed in front of a male.
Particularly when you're just about to start a shift, you know, we need a safe space to get changed in. We undress to our bra and knickers, so, you know, it's not appropriate to have a biological male in there.
Their complaints are about Rose Henderson, an operating department practitioner who identifies as a woman. Rose Henderson first started working here at Darlington Memorial Hospital in 2019 and was allowed to use a female changing room under the Trust's transitioning in the workplace policy. In 2023, complaints from nurses began, and the following year, 26 women signed a letter complaining about Rose's use of the changing room and what they said was inappropriate behaviour inside it.
One nurse, Karen, who's with us today, she experienced a pretty traumatic event where the colleague would ask her, I think 3 times, whether she was going to get changed yet. And Karen's had some past trauma in her life, and she ended up having a panic attack in that situation.
Rose Henderson denied the claims of inappropriate behaviour, telling the tribunal, "I am not the individual they have painted me to be," and seeing the hordes of people online insulting me, my partner and my family has been difficult.
So this is great news, but to think that this has been going on since 2023, nurses being subjected to harassment, nurses having to take legal action just so they can get dressed in their changing room without men present. What message was the NHS Trust putting out there? That the feelings of these nurses doesn't matter, that the safety of these nurses doesn't matter. It tells them that they're not as important. that their protection isn't as important. So I'm glad that this NHS trust has been held accountable. And the question is, how much did this have to do with the Supreme Court ruling? I think it had a lot to do with it.
The Nurses Employment Tribunal case is one of the first to test the Supreme Court decision in April 2025 that defined a woman as someone who was born female. In December 2025, Scottish nurse Sandie Peggie won part of a similar case against NHS Fife. The tribunal found the trust had harassed her, but dismissed her claims against her trans colleague, Dr Beth Upton.
There definitely seems to be some sort of unspoken rule where they're protecting the males in this situation. There seems to be a desire to separate the man from the harassment and just focus on the employer. So in Sandie Peggie's case, her legal team described aspects of the ruling as hugely problematic, arguing it puts the burden on women to object when their privacy and safety are violated in single-sex spaces. I mean, in that case, the tribunal basically said that technically it's not unlawful for a male who identifies as trans to use the female changing room. And there were also some procedural errors where the tribunal judge issued multiple corrections to the ruling, so I'm glad she's pursuing the appeal. And none of this would be necessary if employers stressed the message that employees have to use the changing room and the bathrooms that align with their biological sex, or use the gender-neutral spaces. It's as simple as that. The men at the centre of these cases need to know in no uncertain terms that they have no right using the women's changing rooms. They have no right using the women's toilets, regardless of how they identify, regardless of what piece of paper they have.
It simply isn't the case that the law says you must exclude trans women from changing rooms, lavatories.
Dr Victoria MacLeod was the UK's first transgender judge, now retired over concerns about trans rights and launching a legal challenge against the Supreme Court judgment.
The Supreme Court wasn't asked to and did not make any decision about women's spaces. I don't know any sensible lawyers who would say the For Women Scotland judgment was in any way clear. So we're seeing a lot of unpleasantness in society, and that stems directly from what I think is the willful misrepresentation of what admittedly is a very poorly written and poorly reasoned judgment.
So we're still waiting for guidelines from Bridget Phillipson, the Minister for Women. But the fact is the Supreme Court defined what a woman is. And the Supreme Court ruling reiterated that being a woman is a biological reality. It is not a feeling, it is not an identity. And it certainly isn't a piece of paper. Everybody has their own sex-based protections under the Equality Act based on whether one is either male or female. And there's nothing in between. So all this time, these employers, these businesses were not following the law. It's about time that they start doing that, rather than be claiming to wait for guidelines that probably will never come. Let's just be honest. Otherwise, there will be more lawsuits and I'll be cheering them on.
What would you say to people watching this who might say, this is just transphobia?
They're demanding respect, but what about our feelings? You know, I would just like for them to respect our feelings.
So men who identify as women, they have options, but the females don't. They get told that they can change in a little room with a filing cabinet. They get punished.
If you're at work and you're required to change into a uniform, which these nurses are, then it's reasonable to do that in a single-sex facility. And if there is a man who says he is a woman and he doesn't want to use the men's changing rooms, then it's also reasonable to give him some provision that addresses his needs, but not at the expense of all the women. And thankfully, the judge saw that was a reasonable conclusion. And what's more, it's the law. It's what the Equality Act says. Everyone is protected from discrimination and harassment. He said that the trust had acted unlawfully in giving Rose Henderson permission to use the women's changing rooms. So this is a very welcome common sense result.
There is no excuse whatsoever for infringing upon the women's spaces. And a man who insists on being in a woman's space, knowing that it makes the women uncomfortable, knowing that he is going to be undressing in front of women, doesn't get to play victim anymore. So congratulations to these nurses. I'm so glad they didn't back down. I'm so glad they were brave enough to pursue this legal action and they never gave up. These employers need to follow the law. You don't need to be spoon-fed, how to implement this. You don't need guidelines. Just do the right thing. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Like, comment and subscribe. Take care of yourselves and God willing, I will see you in the next video.